Good evening and welcome back to your weekly AVIAtest webinar. My name is Jeff and I'll be your host tonight, and we're going to talk about tonight the runway lighting. Yes, I promised that I would make a small refresher for all of you now that we can all fly again, which is very good news. Well, maybe some of you will be tempted to go fly at night. So it maybe is a good time to brush up on your knowledge of the runway and taxiway lights. All right. So let's not wait much more and dive right into it. What does the runway lighting consist of, basically? The barest minimum, the very, very minimum to light a runway, to have a runway certified for operations at night, consists of three main things. And let's take a look immediately. All right, let's go here. As you can see, I'm still here in the corner. The bare minimum you have is the runway threshold. So that would be this green bar here at the beginning of the runway. Then you will have the runway edges, so on both edges of the runway, which are being lit in white, and the runway end lit in red. Now, as some of you may have experienced, these runway threshold and runway ends are of course displayed both ways, but in different colors naturally. So it means that if the runway is used in the opposite direction, the controllers must be able to change the colors of the lights. And I did have the question once or twice through my career, how do you do that? Do you send somebody, one person actually asked me, do you send somebody in this little airport vehicle to turn the lights? No, we don't do that. No. Actually, it's much more simple than that, as you will see now. We're using, in fact, these special light fixtures which have color filters that go both ways. So basically, one side being green, the other side being red. Right, so with this, we can operate a runway at night. Now, this is not sufficient to operate the whole airport at night. There are conditions and everything, but we're not going to deal into that today. This is going to be specific about lighting. What I would like to mention at this point is that controllers are the ones who operate the runway lights, either directly, they have a control panel in the control tower, or through somebody else, basically. If maybe sometimes they have to call the electricians to switch on something, or the airport authority has the control panel, but the decision to use runway lights and how to use them rests with air traffic control. Nowadays, in most control towers, there is a control panel for lights. So that's how it's done. There are, of course, backup solutions. If the control tower panel fails, the controllers are still able to contact technicians who will have a more administrative access to the thing and will be able to switch on, maybe sometimes even manually, all the lighting of the airport. But for convenience, for safety as well, most of the time it is operated straight from the tower. Oops, sorry for the flickering there. It is operated from the tower, so that if you as a pilot have a request to pass to air traffic control regarding the lighting, the changes can be made very, very quickly. And we will talk about that a little later when we come to taxiway lights, because for some reason the taxiway center lines, when present, are displayed in a very bright green color. And even though the power delivered to the light bulbs is the same, they appear much brighter. That's because of the shade of color chosen by ICAO, presumably that the filters give a different, or I don't know if the U is brighter. I don't know exactly how, but I know that I've received a lot of requests from pilots to dim the taxiway lights, because usually they're the brightest in the whole airfield. And for our ATPL friends out there who overfly a lot of airports at night, actually it's one of the easiest ways to spot an airport at night is to look for the green taxiway lights, because they're the brightest, and you will probably have that experience that actually the first thing you see from an airport at night are the taxiway center lines, because they're extremely bright. All that to say that yes, it does happen that pilots request controllers, can you please dim the runway lights, or please dim the approach lights. That's perfectly okay to do. It's all in all, it has to be adapted to your visual comfort. It's okay to ask, there's absolutely no problem. Controllers will always be happy to oblige. Now, we have settings, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult for us to step out of these settings, all right? It's not always possible for us to choose which brightness. I mean, we have 5 or 10 different steps from the dimmest to the brightest. But if we're at the dimmest level and you ask us, can you please dim even more some more the runway light? Well, no, there's a lowest value below which we can't go, and then yeah, we're really happy to do anything. But if we do any less, then the runway will switch off, and that's not something you want when you're on short final, for example. Now, let's go back to our little image here. And yeah, so this we saw already. All right, another type of runway. So here, in this case, it's a more complete setup, as you can see. As I told you before, the 4, or the 3, okay, let's say the 3 minimum elements to light a runway are the threshold, the end, and both edges. That's why I said 4, because there are 2 edges, so okay, 3 or 4. But on top of that, for the runway, we can use a center line and touchdown zones, which are these little bars here on either side of the center line, and which can be very useful at night or in low visibility operations. So that's for our friends flying IFR, because they give you a better sense of immediate height. So it means that when you're just above the ground and you're flaring your aircraft, it gives you a better perspective on your exact position above the ground, because otherwise it would just be pitch black below you. And one of my flight instructors, when I was still learning to be a pilot, I did a few night flights. The guy, Renaud, if you listen to this, I'm really happy, guy. But what Renaud, my instructor, told me back then was that the moment the landing light actually shines on the asphalt, is about the right moment to start flaring. Right, it's okay, it's a very good tip, but it doesn't seem to, I mean, it's quite empirical. Here, with the touchdown zones, the touchdown zone lights, we have a better view because it creates some sort of a carpet effect on the runway, and it can be quite useful. Now, another thing is that these lights can be very, very dim, because since they're very close to each other, and since there's a huge number of them, if they're too bright, it's just going to be counterproductive, and pilots are going to be like, oh, no, 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 you got to switch that off, man, because I can't see anything. So they're quite dim, but they're quite useful, actually. As you can see here, the center line is color-coded. How does that work? Center lines are generally associated with instrument runways. Runways that do have an instrument approach. As you can see here, we have a very complete approach lighting, which is also very typical of an instrument runway. But everything will work regardless of your flight rules, of course. So even if you're approaching as a VFR flight, but you're approaching to an instrument runway, the controllers will not switch off all the fancy instrument equipment just because they know you're a VFR flight. Not at all. So this is a typical setup that you will see at a larger airport, for example. And this Centerline system works this way. Basically, the main color, as you can see, is white, just like the edges, except that it's not white until the end. It's white until 900 meters before the runway ends, where it becomes alternating red and white. And that alternating red and white continues until 300 meters before the runway end, where it switches to only red. Now, you've guessed it, I'm sure. That's just to give you a sense of the impending arrival of the end of the runway. So it means that when you're rolling there and you see the lights changing color, it's about time to stop the airplane because you're reaching the end. When the lights start becoming red and white, it means you have 900 meters left. And when the lights turn to only red, then it means you only have 300 meters left. So I hope that by the time you reach these lights, all your wheels are on the ground and you already started braking. Because otherwise, as the song says, you can always go around. So maybe some of you know that brilliant, brilliant song. All right. What else can we say about this setup? There's a system here called PAPI, Precision Approach Path Indicator, which I'm sure you know. But still, I'm going to go over it because when I was training to be a controller, I probably asked the stupidest question about it ever to an instructor, whom, Anthony, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry again for the question, and I really still feel bad up to today. PAPIs are lights that show you your vertical alignment with the ideal glide slope, right? And I asked this gentleman, okay, so tell me, how do they work? Is there a system of radar or detection? And I was kind of flabbergasted because if it works based on a radar or a detection system, how is it working when there's more than one aircraft on final? And actually, what Anthony said to me, told me, Jeff, think a little bit about it, and let's talk again tomorrow. And I really thought very, very hard, and I said, well, I really can't figure it out. I don't know. And actually, he explained to me the very next morning that it's very, very simple. There's absolutely no technology in it. There are just 4 light bulbs with a colored filter, and the colored filter are in different positions in each of the lines, so that you would see more or less of red or more or less of white depending on the height you are. So there I learned it at my own expense. All right, let's go to the next image. Now, what can we see here? I hope you can see correctly because the picture is pretty small. But here we can see that, okay, it looks like an instrument runway. All right, because it has a very impressive approach lighting system. But as you can see here, there is no center line. And when there is no center line, well, you can't have that indication that you're reaching the end of the runway, right? Because you don't have these red and white and then only red. What they do instead in that case, when it's not possible to put a center line for any reason, they actually put a different color code on the runway edge lights. And the edge lights are the runway edge lights are white, and they become yellow in the last third or the last 600 meters of runway, whichever is the least, of course. Now, to answer the question of Madame Aviatrix, the distances for the center lines are fixed. Basically, I know that it doesn't make too much sense, but it's one of the things that ICAO said that, in fact, these very, very short runways with less than 900 meters and with a light, and with lighting system, and with an instrument approach are most probably extremely rare, if any. So I wouldn't be too surprised if by looking it up we wouldn't find any runway that would have that typical problem. And in the case of the side, the edge light color coding, then the problem is solved, because the regulation says either 600 meters before the end or the last third, whichever is the least. Now, as you can see here, we also have a red rectangle or trapezoid or something at the end, which says stopway. Yes, absolutely. A stopway, just to remind everybody, a stopway is a place that you can use more or less in case of emergency braking. And it's a place where you're supposed to go only if you can't stop before. It's the last few meters where you still have pavement. But usually it's not maintained all too well, and you're not supposed to use it. It is displayed as red, of course, because you're not supposed to go there. And it will also be displayed as red if you approach from the other side. All right. Now here, as you see, there are also these little blue lights before the threshold, which are called starter extension. Yes, that exists. Now, a starter extension is not very, very common, actually. It's a piece of taxiway that is connected to the runway, that is exactly in line with the runway, but it's not a displaced threshold. Why isn't it? It's probably because the airport didn't want to invest too much money into extending the runway. So it didn't want to, the airport didn't really want to create a deeper, stronger runway, or as wide, because usually starter extensions are are not as wide as the runway. You can actually see it on the diagram. It's done pretty well. And it's essentially a taxiway. That's why the edges are blue, like taxiways. If we had a displaced threshold, then actually what would happen here is that instead of the blue lights, we would have red lights, and the green threshold would still be at the displaced threshold, at the place from which you can start landing, basically. All right. Now let's continue. Now let's take a look at the general disposition of lights on the airport. We talked about the runway, now we're going to talk about the taxiways. Okay. As we just mentioned, the edge lights are blue. They're very, very dim. Actually, they're not too necessary. They are because they need to outline the shape of the taxiway. But when you're taxiing, if you have a good taxi light, if it's not broken and you're using it properly, you can actually see the ground markings. And if you follow them properly, then you will not run the risk of stepping over the edge. So, yeah. Actually, in some places, to save on costs, to save on installation costs, and also on running costs, these blue lights are replaced by studs, little like about this high, blue reflective studs that are placed where the lights would normally be, and basically they only shine when you shine a beam of light at them. Okay. All right. So that would be for taxiway edge. Now the taxiway center line, as pointed out earlier, is green. That's the initial idea behind it. Now, for airports which have instrument runways, one of the inconvenience of an ILS is that it has areas that are, there's a sensitive and a critical area, which cannot be penetrated by any object moving or fixed without running the risk of creating interference with the ILS signals. So just in order to pinpoint it, to underline the fact that there's a critical and a sensitive area, when you are in a protected area, when an ILS protected area, and you're on a taxiway, instead of plain green, the center lines will be alternated yellow and green, yellow and green. Now, as you can see here, it's quite interesting because they say after the stop bar it becomes yellow and green. Well, yes, because the stop bar is where? It's at the holding point. And where is the holding point? Well, at the critical area, at the limit of the critical area of the ILS. That's, yeah, just that simple. All right. It also means, and that's very interesting after you land, let's imagine here you land on runway 02. So you're coming from the right here, and you're approaching this high-speed exit taxiway. The alternated yellow and green will show you up to where you have to taxi to basically leave the runway. After you pass the last yellow line, you can say, all right, now runway vacated. If you still have yellow lights in front or under you, then it means you're still interfering with the ILS critical area. All right. They also mention guard lights here. What is it? Guard lights are actually a set of alternating yellow lights that just don't do anything else but flash all the time. It's just an additional reminder for runway safety that you're about to enter a runway. That's all it's good for. All right. Now about that stop bar. Let's take a look at this. A stop bar, and this is very, very important. Pay a lot of attention here. A stop bar is a lit insert into the ground. It's a row of lights that are inserted in the concrete or in the asphalt that shines red when the controller wants to protect the runway. Usually they're installed and used at airports that can accommodate low visibility operations, so operations with visibility of less than 600 or even 500 meters to essentially zero. Cat 3 operations, for example. And the red bar, the red stop bar, is something that you are never allowed to cross. Never, ever. Except, because it's always the same in aviation. We always say, you're never allowed to do this. There's always an except, right? You're going to tell me what happens if the stop bar fails and it's stuck on red, basically. Well, yeah, there are two possibilities here actually. What if it's broken and it doesn't shine at all? Well, if it doesn't shine at all, okay, you're still supposed to wait at the holding point. And you're still supposed to have an air traffic control clearance to enter the runway, so it shouldn't matter that much actually. But if it's stuck on red, and you remember, oh, but this guy on the webinar, he told me that I couldn't cross under any circumstance. That's pretty much true, except that we can, in this case, controllers can send a follow me car to the runway to actually pull you across, to guide you across the stop bar. The reason why we have to do that is exactly this. When we switch the lead in, so when we switch off the stop bar, the rest of the center line, the green center line, switches on, and it's called a lead-in taxiway light. It means the lead-in basically leads you into the runway. But when we switch back on the stop bar, or when it switches back on by itself, then these lead-in green lights switch off automatically as well. All right. Okay. And now let's go to our final image here. This is what the crew of an aircraft will see when approaching one of these rapid speed, and that has a straight portion that's long enough for you to bring the aircraft to a complete stop. The straight portion making it easier. Okay, first, the angle is not too hard to negotiate. The turn is quite shallow, and also the straight portion of the taxiway allows you to bring the aircraft to a stop. Now, when you're still on the runway and you're approaching a high-speed exit taxiway, you will see 6 yellow lights on the runway before you reach that rapid exit taxiway. Look at them here. 3, then 2, then 1, and then you see the green and yellow lights starting. Right? So if on a runway you see 3 yellow lights perpendicular to the axis of a runway, well, that means you're approaching a high-speed exit. That's just all it means at the moment. All right. And that is it for runway lighting and taxiway lighting, of course. So I hope this was refreshing for you. Thank you for watching. Once again, we're very, very happy to see all the numbers everywhere. All the feeds that we're broadcasting are very, very nice, and it's very nice Thank you also for the questions. We'll be very happy to see you next week. We're trying to set up something very, very interesting for everybody. Some maybe a little bit, tiny bit controversial, but we're trying to keep it as interesting as possible. And be there next week, because we may even have a very, very good surprise for you. Have a nice evening. Have a nice remains of weekend if you're on a weekend. And until next week. Thank you, and bye-bye.